for your patience, and I think we can kick off. So welcome to this webinar, Next Gen Assessment Using Data Analytics to Objectively Measure Compliance Program Effectiveness. I'm Parth Chanda. I'm the founder and CEO of Lextegrity, and I have the privilege and honor really to be joined by two compliance leaders and visionaries today. Hui Chen, Senior Advisor at Ropes & Gray's Insights Lab and the former DOJ compliance expert, and Justin Ross, Vice President and Global Chief Compliance Officer at FedEx. Thank you both for joining the webinar today. I thought it'd be great to start maybe with each of you just introducing yourselves, because I don't think I could do justice to each of your bios. So maybe, Hui, if we could start with you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here. My name is Hui Chen. I am Senior Advisor at R&D Insights Lab, which is an interdisciplinary consulting practice that resides within the law firm of Ropes & Gray. I've been with the lab for about almost a year now. Prior to that, I was in my own private practice, and before that, I was the compliance counsel expert at the fraud section in the Department of Justice. And I came to that position after having spent quite some time doing legal and compliance work in-house at Pfizer, Microsoft, and Standard Chartered Bank. And before that, I was a prosecutor with the Department of Justice.
All right, thank you. Hey, how about Justin?
Thanks, Parth, and always feel a little inadequate having to follow Wei in that awesome compliance background. But Justin Ross, I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for FedEx. I've been in this role since 2019. I'm a FedEx lifer, been here for almost 20 years, and my team is responsible for traditional compliance function for almost 600,000 employees, and we operate in 220 countries around the world. So plenty to do and plenty to keep me up at night.
All right, and we'll talk about some of that today. So, and last but definitely least of the three here, I'm Parth Chanda. I'm the founder and CEO of Lextegrity. I am a compliance lawyer by training. I spent about a decade in-house, my last role overseeing the ex-US compliance program at Pfizer. Launched Lextegrity about 6 years ago. We're a technology company bringing more scalable next-gen compliance data analytics and workflow technology to global organizations. And so really excited to be here, and I'd love to jump in. So we have a real exciting webinar today that's going to deep dive hopefully into a lot of depth into how organizations can really use data analytics to measure how effective their compliance program is. But before we start, I wanted to just make sure everyone knows you can add any questions throughout the process. I'll be monitoring the question log, and we'll try to get to all the questions that you have. And I know that Hui and Justin, you'll have a lot to say on the topic, but please do keep those questions coming. So to start it off, Hui, I'd love to start with you. You were in-house at 3 global companies, at a prosecutor first, and then at the DOJ as their compliance expert, and now you're back advising companies on how to measure the effectiveness of their compliance programs in really new and innovative ways. So, you've had the opportunity to think about compliance programs and compliance program effectiveness using, for many years wearing many hats. And so I'd love to just start with you with really the existential question. What is an effective compliance program?
An effective compliance program is a program that does what it sets out to do, which for a compliance program is to prevent, detect, and remediate violations of laws and policies. So that's a short definition. When someone or an organization or a person is effective at something, that means that they're able to accomplish what they set out to do.
Yeah, and maybe I'd love for you to maybe drill down into each of those things. Like, what does appropriate prevention and then detection and remediation look like in your mind?
I was actually refraining from going into it because that can easily go for 3 hours. So let me do a light touch to sort of kick off our discussion. To prevent seems obvious, is to keep something that was going to happen not happen. So these are efforts that you make, for example, in the area of training, in communications, in educating your employees and guiding their conduct so that they never even go down the wrong path. So to put it in I like to use analogies, at the crossroads, you put up all the signs so that they don't go down the wrong one. That's prevention. Detect is when they did go on. So somehow your first line failed, which is prevention. They did go down the wrong path, either intentionally or by mistake. How quickly can you catch it? So it's a question of, do they walk 10 yards into that line and you're able to stop them and say, whoa, not this path, go back. Or do they walk 10 miles and 20 miles, 100 miles on that wrong path and you don't even know? So detection is about your ability to find out what's gone wrong. And one of the important ways of measuring that is what I referenced is how early can you detect it. When you find a wrongdoing, and by the time you found it's been going on for 10 years, that's a bigger problem. That's a bigger failure than if you have found something that's just hours or days into its wrong path. To remediate is even more simpler. So it's after somebody has done the wrong thing, what do you do to fix the system so that, one, any damages that's been caused has been repaired, and two, you do everything you can to make sure the same thing doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I mean, maybe underline a couple of points there. I think, it's a life cycle, right? I mean, every quote unquote effective program will have some non-compliance. And I think that's where a lot of compliance officers maybe get a little tripped up. Humans are humans. There's always going to be some non-compliance in your compliance program, and it can still be effective if you have the appropriate, from my perspective, if you have the appropriate tooling in place that prevents, in your rubric, prevents the non-compliance as much as it feasibly can, but then detects and remediates before, as you said, when you're in mile 1 and not mile 26, before the non-compliance really becomes systemic. And I think the DOJ has done a lot in the last year talking about immediate detection and things like that. And I think there's a lot of companies that are getting as closer and closer to the standards of immediate detection as they can, as they ever have in the past. And those prevention processes that you talk about, prevention controls, approvals, due diligence, contracting, your procure to pay process, all those things you have put into place are really, really important. They're necessary, but they're part of the equation, right? I mean, they're insufficient alone, right, to have a fully effective end-to-end program. I don't know, Justin, if you wanted to add anything to that.
No. Look, I think you guys hit it. I mean, I think there are elements in each one. Wei went a little more granular, but and a lot of this is known by everyone here on the call. But I always break it down into even more granular aspects. Prevention is around shaping employee behavior. We haven't talked about that and how hard that is sometimes to shape employee behavior. Developing and managing those controls to prevent wrongdoing, developing and managing those controls to detect wrongdoing, and then remediating those identified gaps. But if I go back to that shaping employee behavior, because that's not perfect and will never be perfect, that's why analytics are so important. It's for us to be able to catch those issues where that employee behavior, for us, 600,000 employees, I think 599,999 of them are very good, awesome people, but you're going to have one every now and then, a bad apple. And as we talk about analytics, that really is going to help us to identify those areas and be a little bit more proactive in getting ahead of the employee behavior issues.
Yeah, and to know how to shape behavior going forward, right? If you don't understand the problem, and that's often where the analytics can help you understand where those risks are hidden within your organization beyond what you're getting through the helpline, because again, that's going to be a small fraction of voluntarily disclosed within your organization information. But yeah, that kind of data is critical to continue to refine your preventative controls. Wait, did
I
you
mean,
want,
the data,
do you want to add something?
data is important all throughout, I think. So data is important for you to measure how effective your efforts at shaping behavior is. Data can tell you how good you are at detecting, and data can tell you how good you're remediating. So absolutely, there's different data, but different data sets would tell you how good you are, how effective you are in each of those areas.
Yep. And there's different shades of detection as well. It's just, I think, where compliance organizations are evolving as well with data analytics, right? The traditional approach of internal audit, proactive reviews, and on-site visits, third-party audits, and your hotline, right? That's been the foundation of detection for the last 10 years. All of that's great, and it's still needed, but is it continuous? How close is it to real time? How comprehensive is it? How much does it still rely on, either picking the right samples or the right people knowing about the information and then reporting it? I think that, I think we're seeing more and more companies getting to the realization that you need a much more holistic monitoring program. I mean, I'll sometimes think about, COVID surveillance as a nice analogy. You have two countries, one that just reports COVID cases based on hospital data and one that does extensive testing throughout the public. You could say with, if you count the first country, you consider the first country one that has a hotline type approach where you only report it once you really know that it's a problem. And the second one country is one that's more monitoring based and it has a hotline approach as well, taking the hospital data. You could say that the first country has a much more effective mitigation program against COVID because it's got far fewer COVID cases. But I don't think any of us would say that. So I think that's where we're moving as a compliance kind of profession, which is a good development.
Well, I also think, let's take your analogy, apply them to organizations. When in the case where you're only getting it from the hospitals, you're getting them only when they're severe. So the traditional approach, you're only getting them afterwards, sometimes way afterwards. So, if you're doing, let's say, an annual audit, you might be catching something that's a year old. You're relying on hotline reporting, you might be catching something that's been going on for 5 years. And you're not doing, those methods have limitations in allowing you to catch something, for example, a transaction just as it happens. Or this invoice just got approved but hasn't gone out yet. If you're able to actually stop that, I count that towards a point in prevention and a point in detection, because your detection system is so good that you're actually able to prevent this. Your employee did engage in a mistake, but your company didn't because you were able to catch it in time.
I'll say something, to follow up that way, while that data is something that's sort of after the fact, it's more reactive than proactive. I think, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, I think there are ways to use that data in the aggregate to be predictive. And we'll talk a little bit about hotline data, because look, once something happens and it happens and it happens and it happens, it's a pattern. And that's typically, that can be more predictive. That's going to happen again. It's going to happen in this location. It's going to happen with this manager. So whereas just one report, is more, all right, I detected it after the fact. I maybe stopped it in its tracks. But if you get 70 of those reports and you can plot that out on a map and it's a certain location involving the same managers, then I think you can use that to be a lot more proactive, which I think it's so important to try to look at data in the aggregate, and it doesn't take, crazy sophisticated tools to do that. And I think that'll be a theme today is, we can be effective in our data analytics without having some cool shiny tool to do it.
Yeah, and there's different data sources that you can combine together, and there's patterns within each of those data sources to take advantage of. Yeah, for sure. Justin, I do want to ask you though, because we had this great conversation, to go back to that existential question for you. I think it's going to be unfair to ask you in 3 to 5 minutes to explain what an effective compliance program means to you at FedEx. So maybe I'll ask you a more specific question, which is, in the space of third-party risk management, I know in particular FedEx is really doing some innovative things and moving your program to a more next generation approach to managing that third-party risk. Can you talk a little bit more, using that risk domain as a proxy of how kind of you think about the evolution of your effectiveness analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give a little bit of background about our program because I think it helps in the context of where we've been and where we're going. So we're a relatively young compliance program. And what I mean by that is the centralization of compliance. So prior to 2015, we were very decentralized, like a lot of companies start out, meaning our business units and operating companies, they kind of did compliance on their own. We didn't have a central team that, provided the overarching compliance strategy for the company. So since 2015, since we did centralize a lot of the compliance processes, we've been working to develop these enterprise-wide processes around prevention and detection. And it hasn't been an easy journey. As anyone that's had experience, I'm sure you've been there. Parth, you've probably been there in your days in corporate. If you've had experience in centralizing any function, you know the challenges that come along with it. Some business units want to continue to do their own thing. They don't want to give you information. You got different systems, different AP systems, ERP systems. So sometimes it's difficult to centralize certain compliance functions. So what we did, at least on the third party in transaction monitoring standpoint, we took baby steps. And that's going to be a theme that I continue throughout today, is taking baby steps on any kind of compliance initiative. So before we could get proactive with analytics around third-party relationships, we had to get better on this reactive or preventative side. So with the third-party relationships and transactions, we first started working, just doing some ad hoc stuff. We worked with an internal audit to do ad hoc tracking and monitoring of third-party transactions to detect potentially improper or fraudulent payments. And that's not groundbreaking. I think everyone does that, but we had to start somewhere. And what that did was, it really helped us learn more about our business, about our vendors, our third-party relationships, what those transactions look like. And it helped us to learn what did a valid transaction look like and what did an improper transaction look like. So we kind of did that groundwork for a few years. And after we were on that preventative journey, we felt we were ready to take a more proactive approach, to be, instead of preventive, kind of instead of reactive, be a lot more proactive. And one of the main reasons, look, tactically, we couldn't do that because we had a bunch of different AR and ERP systems across the enterprise. So we finally got on one AR and AP system. So that was a big step for us to be able to do this across the enterprise. So once we were there, once again, baby steps again, we thought, all right, we want to monitor transactions in real time. We really want to be able to see these in real time across the enterprise. So we conducted an RFP for a vendor that could help us do that. We selected the vendor, and shameless plug, Lextegrity. We're working with Lextegrity on this right now. And what we decided to do, and this was something that I've done a lot on a lot of compliance initiatives, and it's not groundbreaking, I don't think either, is a small POC first to see how this would work. Let's take a couple of countries, a couple of high-risk countries, and let's start with those. First of all, that's important because it's cheaper. I'm not going to be able to come out spending, $10 million. Because it's cheaper, you have less approvals, you can do it yourself. You don't have to get too many involved. So it was a small POC, a set number of countries. It was a lot cheaper to do it that way, and allowed us to kind of test, mess up, test again, see if everything worked. And that's the way that I would approach that. So these baby steps, finding out a vendor that's going to help you, having a strategy for it, and then I suggest doing a POC. And we're in the middle of the POC right now, building the POC. And hopefully once that POC is effective and we get it working like we want it to work, we'll increase the scope to all the countries in the world. But we still got some work before we get there.
Justin, I would love to react to some of what you said. I so appreciate a number of the things that you've said there. So I love the fact that you started by studying the data you already had. So this is by, this is before you got to anything fancy at all. Using the traditional data that you had, you used it to understand the problem. What do problematic transactions look like? What are their attributes? You then took those baby steps, which I strongly and consistently advocate, because not only I think for the reason that you articulated that it's cheaper, but it also have a lot of other advantages. Like, one, it's more manageable when you're just doing a couple of pilot projects with a couple of specified units as opposed to the entire company. It also gives you more data to study. So you can see how this works, what changed, what got better, what needs to be tweaked, and all of those. So what I would characterize that is you're using basically a scientific experimental mindset. You're studying what you have. You're taking baby steps to test something out, and you use what you learned from that testing out to then gradually expand your program, and you're learning along the way. I just think all throughout those approaches are key to anybody, I think, who wants to make big organizational changes, because a lot of times we all think big and we're encouraged to think big. Let's just, get this all done, change it all throughout the organization. But when you think big, there's bigger costs and bigger risks and a lot more to get your hands around. But when you start with those baby steps, you have a lot more evidence and data along the way to convince your stakeholders, as well as just being able to manage the project a lot more efficiently.
Absolutely.
I just think that's
absolutely
smart.
And I never, look, I'm not going to take credit for the baby step thing. Wasn't something I thought up, right when I got in this role. I made mistakes. I made those mistakes of trying to go big, and really, learn from those and realize that, look, you're not going to be able to boil the ocean right off the bat. You're not going to be able to, to solve world peace right off the bat. Take it one step at a time. And it really helped. And you're right, to get and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later with board approval. If you start small and cheap, and I don't know how everyone's board works, but at the level where you don't have to get executive approval and board approval, then you can test it. And then once you're really ready to build it, where it may cost a little bit more, you got a much better case to make to the board and executive management to support you on that.
Absolutely.
And I would add, there's really a practical and tactical point as well in terms of evolving your analytics themselves, right? So you don't want to implement a set of canned analytics at your organization. FedEx is going to be very different from a life sciences company or an oil and gas company, or a company that's using distributors. If you're not using distributors, so the last thing you want to do is just take an off-the-shelf, kind of canned set of analytics and run that on your data that other companies are running on their data. You want to tweak those analytics. You want to tweak those algorithms. Take all of those insights, that Justin, that you mentioned, that you've gleaned from your investigations and audits, and build your analytics model around that. And so if you turn that on globally, like, you're going to learn something from that data. So if you turn it on in phases, your next phase of markets that you bring in, you're going to tweak that algorithm some more for the next set of markets. So there's really a lot of practical, tactical reasons of doing that way as well. So there's a bunch of questions that came in, and one of these questions I think ties a little bit to what both of you were talking about, measuring the ROI of your compliance program, and I guess of your data analytics efforts. Like, how do you actually measure? No, this is a really tough question, so I'm asking the toughest one first. There's like 5 questions to go through, but this is the toughest one. How this person is mentioning that they use their training completion rates and answers to quiz questions today to look at ROI on their compliance program investments. How, in a world of data analytics, transaction monitoring, et cetera, how do you each think about measuring the return on the investment that you're making in data analytics?
I'll start if you want, Wei, and give you sort of, and look, I'm not saying this is the perfect way to do it, But I think you got to show wins. And what I mean by wins, I'm not saying necessarily data and a bunch of metrics, but wins. Show, all right, hey, our system or this transaction monitoring caught this. Otherwise, if it wouldn't have caught this, we would have missed it and it could have been $1 million fraud. Or, this proactive, alert line program that we had, we got into this station and we addressed this before it got out of hand and caused all these kind of problems. So if you can show some wins, meaning specific situations where your analytics program caught something that otherwise would not have been caught through your preventative or detective controls or shaping employee behavior, then I think that means the world. Actual practical situations that you can show executive management, hey, this saved us here.
Oh, I cannot agree more. So the traditional metrics, training completion rate and quizzes, they have nothing to do with effectiveness in compliance programs at all. Training completion rate is an indicator of your power of compulsion. So it's basically a measurement of your ability to compel your employees to do something you tell them to do. That's really all it is. It's not that one thing. It doesn't tell you they do all the things that you compel them to do. You tell them you must complete this training and they do it. And the higher the percentage, the more effective you are at making them do this one thing. So that's all. That's the measurement for that. The quiz at the end tests your employee's short-term memory. I don't know how that contributes to their work at your company at all, but I'm glad they have short-term memory, I guess. So that's the only that metric measures that. So what you want to, if you want to think about the metrics for how good you are at preventing, detecting, and remediating, and particularly prevention, you have to do what Justin says, is looking at the concrete results. What is the outcome of your program? So in the area of third-party payments that we've been focusing on, you really want to be able to show those wins. And, it's how do you show those wins? This is something almost nobody does, is to take baseline measurements. You don't know how far you have run if you don't know where your starting line was. So taking a baseline measurement before you implement anything, or just as you start to implement something, and then taking it at regular intervals, 6 months, 12 months, it would help you capture a lot of those wins that Justin is talking about. So it's not just the individual stories of, that you can say, hey, we stopped this payment before it went out the door. We made sure there was no duplicate payments, duplicate vendors for that. But you can actually add that all together. Think about how powerful it is when you say, look, when you say to your senior management board, when we started this program, we were paying X million in duplicate payments, problematic payments, blah, blah, blah. Well, now, 6 months later, it's been reduced by 40%. 12 months later, it's been reduced by 80%. But you won't be able to say that unless you've taken that baseline. So always remember, this is what, every time I work with the clients, whether it's a training program, so even in a training program, for example, I would ask, what is your goal for your training? Just, look, I would say some are very honest with me and say, oh, our only goal is to satisfy the regulators. In which case, completion rate is wonderful. You can show regulators that, hey, you want me to do this, and I was able to make them do it. But if your goal is to teach knowledge, is it to change behavior, then you have to measure those. So if your training program, for example, is to teach employees about a whole new approval system that you're rolling out, or these are new employees, you want to see what is their rate of mistake before or just when you wrote out the program versus 6 months later. If their mistake rate, if your problems are dropping, that means that training program is successful. Not the quiz, but their actual behavior, what you're trying to accomplish by that training.
I think there's very, very well said by both of you, and maybe just to continue along that thread, the baseline is what you can also use analytics to do, because analytics will give you the baseline. So like when we implement analytics at an organization, our analytics platform will bring in historical data. We'll bring in a year's worth, 6 months or a year's worth of historical data, and the initial scoring will happen on that data so that you have a baseline. And so the measurement of ROI is exactly the way, to your point, as you said it so artfully, is seeing how those trends change over time, because you can aggregate up those transactional scores to a business unit, to a country, to a set of countries, to a region, to individual vendors or vendor types, individual employees in individual employee roles. And so you can see how that would change over time. So a year into the program, you can see what the analytics spit out on day 1 and what they're spitting out on day 365. And if as you get more and more advanced, you can actually see how interventions, way to your point, which I love, is how interventions can change that as well. So we've done a lot of training on our gifts and hospitality program. We're not checking that you understand the quiz. We're checking that you actually are adding your receipts. We don't have any forensic issues on the T&E side from our data or on our invoice side through the procurement process, because we've done this intervention. Has it actually worked? Has it actually changed behavior? So I think there's a lot you can do once you're starting to use the data itself to give you that ROI. One of the questions, I think maybe, oops, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, let me just add one more thing. I also think these, speaking this type of language of using actual data that matters to business, that gives insight to how the business is operating, is typically very much appreciated by other stakeholders. Justin, I would love to hear if that's been your experience.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. It's absolutely, and it's speaking their language too. I mean, think about it, Way. The business does this as well. Compliance is behind the times, is not as far as an industry as we'd like to be on analytics and being proactive and all that. The rest of the business typically is, because look, that's revenue generating. So absolutely they appreciate it. Not, at the executive management, they appreciate and understand it. At the board level, they appreciate and understand it. 100%.
And I think another one of the questions, maybe Justin, for you that I'd throw out there is, can't data also be helpful in assessing compliance risks in the first place? So I know we've talked about data from a detection standpoint and maybe even proactive from a prevention standpoint, but can you talk a little bit about how the data analytics that you're looking to implement and some of the other data that you're using from your hotline analytics efforts that you're doing, and then Hui, I'd love to hear from you, how that's feeding into your overall risk assessment? Because I know the traditional model of risk assessment is, again, pretty survey-based. ERM can be fairly high level, not very granular, and can still be very subjective and kind of based on people's perceptions. How are you using data, whether it's hotline or elsewhere, on the risk assessment process?
Yeah, I'll give. Look, I mean, I think that insights here are really important to the risk assessment process. So everything that we talked about, the transaction monitoring, the hotline data, we use all of these as sort of data points for our risk assessment. And I'll give an example of how we use this, and I call them insights from our hotline data. And why insights are important is because, look, the data means nothing on a dashboard unless you know, what is this data telling me? What exactly do I need to do with this data? Hotline data is an example. We've got over 550,000 employees around the globe. We operate in 220 countries, and we've got what I call a very well-known and active hotline within FedEx, which I think is a good thing. And we get a lot of reports that come in through that hotline. And admittedly, some of these reports are not what I'd call significant. They may be minor HR matters or what we call workplace civility complaints. But even though they're not significant individually, it's not a massive bribery case, but all of these little cases can mean a lot when you look at them in the aggregate, like I said earlier, especially when you can slice and dice the data to see where they're coming from, the cases are coming from, what individuals are involved, or what issues are involved. So and this is part of our risk assessment process, and how it feeds into that is assessing compliance risk of certain locations. And I'll tell you how that works. So what we've done with the hotline data is we now assign priority and risk scores to each case that comes in. And this is based on Like before we got to here, we were back in that baby step stage I talked about earlier. We were doing spreadsheets and Excel spreadsheets with hotline data, but we were learning our hotline data. We were figuring out what it meant and what was important in each one. So now we're out there where we can assign these priority scores that are based on the complexity and severity of the issue in the case. And that allows case managers to identify and prioritize their investigation resources. So if something has a high priority score, ooh, we got to get on that immediately, right away. We need to put certain people on that. If it's a low priority score, you don't have to get on it right away. You can have HR handle it, things like that. So, that's that helps us assess risk in handling those. Another way we do it is we assign risk scores to these cases as well. So a priority score and a risk score. Risk score is based on the outcome of the case. Was it substantiated or not? What was the action taken? Was it discipline? Was it termination? What type of issue is it? Is it bribery? Is it a minor HR issue? So based on that, we'll assign a risk score, and these risk scores can be aggregated and averaged by location, and that allows the user to quickly identify trends or potential hotspots in these locations that may require focused attention, such as compliance training, audit coming in, something like that. So we'll look at these locations that have a certain number of hotline reports per quarter that exceed this risk threshold, and then we'll reach out to management or audit or some partner to figure out, all right, hey, we got a risk here. We're assessing this risk based on this location. We need to go in there and do something based on that risk score. So that's a lot of detail, but that's an example of how you can use data to feed into that risk assessment process. Now that's a piece, that's a small piece of that overall risk assessment, but it's helping us assess risk of certain locations and those areas that my team is focused on.
Yeah, I think I just want to accentuate things that Justin, you said. So risk assessment is by nature an evolving process. And when I say evolving, it's not a thing that evolves once a year. It's a thing that evolves 24/7, really. Yep. When you have a system that can feed that real-time learning that you're getting from the problems you found into your risk monitoring process, that immediately enhances your risk assessment, because something you learned yesterday, last hour, of this new trend that you just developed, or identified, or a new method of conducting the wrongdoing that you have identified, that helps you to identify where to look. That helps you understand where to look. And that's where it can, if you evolve it quickly and holistically enough, you are going to be able to get to a level of predictive ability. You're going to learn that, interesting, in this part of the world or this part of the operation, it seems like this type of manager do this kind of thing at the end of the month. So you can pay attention to this location, this type of manager at the end of the month. Now, once they catch on that you're actually watching them in the month, maybe they'll shift to the beginning of the month. But then by continuous monitoring, you would be able to catch that. And I think a lot of this is also, Parth, you mentioned survey method. I have a lot of issues with survey methods in so many ways, but I think one problem a couple of important problems with the survey method is that they are as good as the questions you ask. They're as good as how people interpret your questions, and it's single dimension. So if you're really just looking at that one source that you survey to try to help you define the problem, you're not seeing the big picture, because there are so many other data sources out there that when you put it all together, you would be able to see where the risks are. And some of this, I think, is challenging for compliance officers in large organizations, because large organizations are well known for data silos. So it's not that we lack data. Frankly, I don't think any company lacks data these days, any large organization or individuals for that matter. It's a matter of knowing what data exists and which ones will be helpful to you. So one of my favorite examples was I was working with a company that has that works through distributors. They sell through a distribution system. And I was talking to their compliance person, and their compliance person said to me that they're evolving the system where they can track, violations that they found among the distributors. So which distributors have had compliance issues. And I said, well, that's great. Now, have you put that together with your distributors' information? So where do they distribute? How much do they distribute? How big their margins are? What their business patterns are? And this compliance person looked at me. I swear I'm not making this up. She said, we don't have that kind of data. I said, no, you mean compliance doesn't have this data? And she said, no, the company doesn't have this kind of data. I was like, no, that's not possible. That's how you pay distributors. The company must have this data. She insisted, no, company does not have this data. The next meeting I had was with the finance guy, like upstairs. And when I brought up this conversation, he just turned his computer monitor to me. He said, that's the data I'm looking at right now. And what I wanted to say was, can I introduce you to your compliance person downstairs? Because they're clearly not talking to each other. Not only she, hadn't thought of those data, but she didn't know they existed. But maybe she hadn't thought of them because she did not know they existed. But some of this goes into really understanding your business. What kind of data does the business have in order to operate? And talking to your stakeholders and asking them, what are you tracking? What kind of data are you looking at every day? How do you decide how to, make your business decisions? They're all doing it based on some kind of data.
Yeah, and Wade, that in part, if I can comment on that.
Yeah, please.
We had that issue, Wade. Look, it part of our centralization process that I talked about, beginning in 2015. When we were decentralized, obviously the business units, knew what they were doing, but when we came to Central, we didn't know what anyone was doing. So what we did to really help that is we started conducting what we call compliance risk assessments for every business unit. So we've got 8 operating companies, and we would go in and we would meet with like 20 to 30 to 40 business partners from HR, finance, you name it, operations, all that. And we would ask those questions. That's one of the categories of questions we ask. Data. What kind of data do you use? What data is important to you? What data do you have access to? What data, once we tell them what our job was and what we were concerned with, we would ask, what data do you think would be helpful for us in doing that, in helping you manage your risk? So that's been an iterative process. And I think we've come a long way by establishing those relationships with the business partners and asking them those data questions. It's not hard, it's 5 or 6 questions in telling them what you do and why the data is important to you, and then asking them, okay, do you have data? Do you think that can help me? Tell me all the data you do have.
And I know what I love, Justin, that you touched on is it's the data, but it's also the goal, right? It's what can we do with that data? And often, there's a rush to do something, right? In the data analytics space, like we were so behind the curve, we've got to just get this data, put it in a Tableau and start visualizing it. And taking a step back and doing all of that due diligence like you guys have done in terms of what are all the data sets by business that we need for the specific risks for those businesses and the specific goal that we're trying to accomplish from a risk assessment and a risk management perspective. I think it's worth that investment of time to get those questions answered and answered well, and have everyone kind of speaking off the same hymn sheet before you go into build. And it is a kind of a segue to a question that came in a few minutes ago. How do you staff your analytics team? Do you have professional data scientists and analysts? And Justin, I know this is near and dear to your heart because you looked at a number of different approaches, building in-house, hiring a consulting firm, going externally. And I know a lot of compliance officers, we're kind of right now where third-party due diligence was maybe 15 years ago. A lot of compliance officers need to figure out how they're going to move this forward. Can you walk everyone through kind of your thought process, what the considerations that you've had and kind of where you've landed in terms of how you're going forward with it and the staffing that you're building around this process?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, when I'm talking a big game here like FedEx, look, believe me, we on the maturity scale, we were we are maybe in the middle, slightly to the left of the middle. We are not, the most mature data analytics company, but we're on that journey, and we're incrementally, I think, getting better, which is good. So, and look, and I've benchmarked with other companies, and I'm very impressed about the data analytics expertise that they have on their compliance teams. And, we do have what I would call sort of a data analytics or data scientist person that we just hired. And this person had no legal background, no compliance background whatsoever. It's probably the best hire we've ever made. I mean, coming in with a fresh view, the analytics sort of mindset, but a totally fresh view from a compliance or legal perspective. So that's been very helpful. And we do have, when Parth, you've met some members of my team. We've got a lawyer on my team who really focuses on the analytics as well. So we're pretty lean, when you think of personnel from an analytics perspective. But I'll tell you a little bit of other background too about whether, that's why we've leaned on vendors. And I'll tell you why I think that's helpful for us. And, the question comes up a lot, do I build this in-house or do I go to a vendor? And I think that there are pros and cons to both. So obviously, if you've got the resources of the IT department to build it in-house, you can get it done cheaper and it will be configured exactly to your company, because you're building it for you. You're not building it to license to someone. So that's good. The cons are, and I've experienced this, so I've lived it, is unless your company is a company that's in the business of providing these type of tools, compliance tools, and it's probably not, your IT teams may not have the necessary skills or expertise to do it. Example, FedEx, we've got some of the best IT people in the world, the most analytical company that you can think of to be able to get your package where it needs to be and the time it's supposed to be there and then track it the whole way. I mean, that was really groundbreaking when we developed that. But look, we're focused on making sure your packages get where they're supposed to be on time. We are not focused on compliance tools, and we don't have people that are focused on compliance tools. So when you're a company and you have one objective as a company, then a lot of times your IT resources are focused on that objective. So another con to doing it in-house as opposed to vendors, the ongoing maintenance of the tool, upgrading, all that. We built some tools in-house before. As we all know, priorities change over time. You build something in-house, you're at the whim of these changing priorities of your IT teams. Something comes up in the business that's a priority, your tool may be deprioritized. So you've got something that you can't maintain, you can't upgrade, things like that. And a vendor is in that business. They have their best interests and their motivation is to upgrade that tool and provide the best thing in the market. They got motivation to do that. Our IT teams don't necessarily have that motivation. So look, I've had success with in-house tools, but invariably over time, we've had difficulty maintaining and upgrading those due to the changing IT and business priorities. So we'll evaluate both options every time. But I personally lean towards vendor provided tools because of those considerations. And look, every company's different. The IT companies may be a lot better at creating these tools, but in my experience, I think it could be risky to do so because of those long-term issues.
Yeah, I mean,
also
sorry.
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I would also chime in just on this topic of working with organizations that have been struggling with these issues. And I started advocating for the use of data analytics, just about the time, of course, I think you started Lextegrity. So it was early days, and people were, not like today. It's only been a few years, but the mindset change has been significant. But from those days to now, this has been the big question. Do we build or do we buy? I think early days there really wasn't a lot of options. So, where do you buy? There's very limited places where you can buy, and the cost was quite high. I think what changed with this embracing of data analytics is that there are just more options out there when people are thinking about buying. And I think the other mindset block is when you start throwing around words like, well, you can just change the algorithm, that really scares a lot of people. And they're sitting there thinking, well, I don't know how to change an algorithm. I don't know how to write an algorithm. How should I do that? And I must need someone to, I think even today, just recently, I had a conversation with an in-house person when she said she was looking for, you know, a data person. That's really what she just said, well, I need a data analytics person. I said, well, what do you want this person to do? Is, you know, well, I want them to help build our data analytics program. And I said, well, are you looking to buy, or are you want this person to build? Because to build something and, you know, and to manage something are different skill sets. And she couldn't quite get there. To her, this whole data thing is just like some foreign thing. And I think in her mind, she was looking for a translator, someone who can deal with this stuff, making decisions like algorithms, things that I don't understand is sort of what her, and I truly sympathize with that, because as much as I advocate for data, let me just tell you, my data and my actual manipulation skills is pretty much at filter and sort in Excel. That's pretty much my limitation. So I rely on people to interpret for me. But I think what I've seen out there is that a lot of the systems that, you know, systems that are available on the market now does not require you to understand what even an algorithm is. It's pretty much preset, and you can choose in language that I think is very familiar to compliance people. They say, oh, here's a rule that says flag these types of transactions where the vendor has the same bank account as my employee. Oh, that makes sense to me. Yes, I want those flags. So I think my suggestion for people is, before you make that decision, start shopping around, ask for demos to see if this is stuff that really is as foreign and strange as you think, or is it something that you feel like, oh, this is not so bad, I can manage this. You may ultimately still need some, you know, that skill set at some level, but making that decision is going to be the foundation about, you know, who you need to hire to manage that system.
Yeah. One thing, look, I would, and I'm sure this is, everyone understands this, but maybe not. I would conduct RFPs. Conduct RFPs even if you don't have any intention of engaging a vendor. I mean, conduct an RFP to see what's out there, because the vendors will put their best foot forward. They will do demos, like Wei said. I would, if you're thinking about analytics and you know what you're looking at, do an RFP, do a formal RFP, because I've learned way more through RFP processes than I've learned in anything else. One point, and then the next is to touch on Wei's point about sort of analytics being intimidating. Look, everything we're doing on analytics, we could do on a spreadsheet. I could do it in a Word document. The reason why we engage a vendor or may need to work with different stuff is the scale. Is to scale it, we need help with the automation and things like that. But it's not complicated. At the end of the day, I could sit here doing it on a piece of paper, really, as long as you know what your data and what you're trying to accomplish, like Wei said earlier.
And I think you both have said it, and I'm obviously biased here, but I do think this space is going to go the way of email systems, CRMs. You have Teams, you have Zoom, you know what each of them do, you can compare the features, and it's just going to be a process, I think, of education in the compliance community to figure out what you need. But I think for me, the key takeaway is if you're looking at a data analytics tool and you need to use SQL to make changes to your analytics, or you need any data expertise, you don't want to go down that path, because you're going to have to maintain a data scientist, you as a compliance attorney with no data experience is going to have to manage a data scientist and do performance evaluations of them. And I think that's, people underestimate. I think there's a lot of underestimating and overestimating of complexities here. I think there's a little bit of underestimation of what it takes to manage a data scientist and data engineers on your team. And then there's, I think, a lot of overestimation of the complexity of bringing in data from systems. Like, most organizations that are out there like ours that have a data analytics tool have adapters that plug into SAP, that have APIs that connect to Concur. So there's a lot of overestimation of how complex it is to get the data out of these systems, etc. So yeah, I think you both nailed it. I think just take the time, do your due diligence, don't rush into it, because the not all data analytics tools and processes are the same too. There's different philosophies, there's different methodologies, there's different, what's under the hood is different. So, and ultimately, false positives are annoying. You don't want to get a ton of false positives out of your tool. but you definitely don't want to get any or many false negatives where you think your analytics are giving you a lot of comfort and security, but they're missing key things in your data. So you take the time. I think Justin, really good suggestion to do your diligence out there. So I know we're about running out of time. There were some other questions that maybe we can put together some resources around that we'll definitely take down. But maybe Justin, Hui, I'd love to maybe turn it to each of you for some final parting thoughts of encouragement to folks coming out of this conversation.
I'll let Hui, you first.
Okay. I would just say, don't be afraid to ask questions. Go out there, explore what's out there. Don't be afraid to ask your questions. I ask what I believe to be dumb questions all the time. And if you don't understand something, look, you're the buyer. You can ask whatever question you want, and ask until you're satisfied. But I think it's worth exploring because data analytics is here to stay.
Yeah, I'd say, and I think we've touched on this, don't get focused on some shiny, cool tool, this awesome system or awesome dashboard. And I've heard, Hui, Parth, we've heard from DOJ. I've heard from in intimate settings with DOJ and at conferences that they're not expecting everyone to have some shiny tool. I've heard some DOJ folks say that, hey, they've seen some awesome analytics on a spreadsheet because it was thoughtful. It was a great way for that specific company to manage and identify and prevent and detect risk and misconduct. So it doesn't have to be a cool tool. It can be something very simple, and it all depends on your company. It's got to be unique to your company and your situation.
Wonderful. Yeah, not much more to add from me. Just think about that goal, the goal that we've all been talking about today. What tool can help you maintain the effectiveness of your program, to tell you when your program is being effective or not? And yeah, do your homework, really ask all the dumb questions, because this is a brand new space for most compliance professionals, and there's a lot of noise in the marketplace as well in terms of what you need to do or don't need to do. And so take your time, and there's a lot of folks who are out there to help kind of demystify things like Hui and Justin hopefully have done a little bit today. So thank you all for joining. Justin, Hui, thank you so much for your expertise and your willingness to join this. Sorry, Hui.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for moderating.
Okay, thank you. All right, take care.
Thank you.